Boundaries. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change,
Yes.
the courage to change the things that I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. We're starting every single one of these lessons and discussions off with that prayer because it is at the center of why boundaries are important. How do I know the difference between the things that I can't change and the things that I can change and the things that I'm responsible for changing in my life, or the things that I'm responsible for improving if I want to see my circumstances improve? Just as homeowners set physical property lines around their land, we need to set mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual boundaries for our lives to help us distinguish what is our responsibility and what is not. Misinformation about the Bible's answers to these questions has often led to depression, anxiety disorders, eating disorders, impulsive disorders, guilt problems, shame issues, panic disorders, and relational struggles. This is something that affects and impacts people's lives greatly. There are three fundamental principles that we have talked about, and we will continue to review every time we get into this just to get our minds in gear. Every healthy relationship has healthy boundaries. Unhealthy relationships tend to have unhealthy boundaries, and that is within life, whether it is relationship between pastor and parishioner, between husband and wife, between parent and child, between co-workers, boss and co-worker, whatever. Unhealthy relationships tend to have unhealthy boundaries, and every adult is responsible for establishing and maintaining their own boundaries. So as unhealthy boundaries exist and boundaries are being violated, it is up to every healthy adult, or every adult, to establish and maintain their own boundaries, and if those boundaries are not established and maintained, it is a problem with the person not doing that, and not as much as it is a problem with the people that are violating those boundaries. Another thing that we talked about is that people that have their boundaries violated also have a tendency to have problems respecting other people's boundaries oftentimes. And we talked about how people that have a hard time saying no can oftentimes have a hard time hearing no. Because no can be loaded with a whole bunch of other messages. And we talked some examples of things that those two letters can actually mean. Anybody, when you hear the word no, what could be behind that no? Consequences?
Leave me alone.
Leave me alone? That could be what no means. What else could no mean? Some other time. Jake?
No has different emotions to it too.
Yeah.
Could be lots of friends.
Have you lost your mind?
I'm not in the mood.
I'm not in the mood.
So now you say.
Yep. Maybe a couple of expletives attached to that no. And so people that have a hard time hearing no or saying no can sometimes have a hard time hearing no. Likewise, sometimes people that have a hard time hearing no can have a hard time saying no. It tends to be a bidirectional dysfunction. It's not just one side of it. Now, last time we met, we started talking about compliant people. Just to try to remind people what's the deal with compliant people. Yes, compliant people do generally have a hard time saying no. And what are some of the reasons that it can be difficult for them to say no?
They don't want to hurt their feelings.
Don't want to hurt whose feelings?
The aggressor.
Person who answered the question.
Okay.
Maybe they're complaint too.
Don't want to hurt feelings.
Don't want to seem like a bad person.
Okay. And who would make them think that they'd be a bad person for saying no?
Themselves.
The person that asked them, they probably guilt trip them into doing it, or make them feel like a bad person.
Okay, so guilt trip or themselves.
Yes, she has.
So it sounds like it could be an either or thing, but guilt tends to play a large part in that. And sometimes it's your own guilt and a conscience that is more strict than God's conscience is.
Yes.
One of the things that we talked about and asked about was, have you ever held yourself accountable for or felt guilty for something that God did not condemn you for doing? Has your conscience ever been harder, your own conscience ever been harder on you than God's conscience?
Yeah.
And what is the difference between the conviction of the Spirit, we'll say, and your own conscience bugging you about something? Because, sometimes the Spirit, God will let you know something, you made a mistake, and you'll feel bad about it, and that is a conviction there. And then there's other times where God's like, okay, I don't see a problem, and you're beating yourself up. So how do you know the difference between the two? Haven't figured that out yet.
Still voice.
Still small voice? That it can be a still small voice as opposed to just an overriding feeling. Here's what I don't think that there's a clear-cut, easy answer for this, because the Spirit of God deals with different people in different ways. So to say unilaterally there is one way of making that determination would be a little bit narrow-minded. But I would suggest this. If you can't find any sin in the decision you've made, then it's probably not God messing with you or trying to tell you something differently. If you ask yourself, where's the sin in my saying, no, I can't pick somebody up? Not because I don't feel like it, but because I can't. Or sometimes because I don't feel like it, which is another kind. Okay, there's two, I don't feel like it. There's one, I really could, I just don't want to. There's one where I've been ripping and running all week long. This is the first minute I got free. And even though I physically could, I need this time for myself. So we do for one another as our resources allow us to do. And sometimes that resource is time. I need the moment for myself. But is there any sin in my saying no?
No.
If I find out that there is, if I examine myself and I find that there is, then that might be God dealing with me about that no. But if I look at it and say, well, no, there's really nothing wrong, there's nothing wrong with it necessarily, but as soon as the but comes in, that's probably your but.
It depends too on what they're asking you to do.
Right. Because it could be like I need to ride to church, and then something changes real quickly where that doesn't need to happen. And you have your schedule planned as it is, and then all of a sudden you get a text from somebody saying, well, I need a ride, and you might have to say no.
Right. Or I need money. That's a big one.
Oh, here's a good one. I need you to come babysit
Need you to come babysit.
at the last minute
Yeah.
for free.